Thank you, Greg. Appreciate the invite. So gonna try and make this fairly straightforward. When I was thinking about roughly kind of the talk or the topic of the class, I'm gonna try and position it as, based on what we've done with Captricity, some challenges that we've seen around the data strategy, particularly for regulated industries. And I'll get into why that's relevant here in just a moment. But I also want to make it kind of personal, and that's where the stuff that matters thing kind of came up. I'll tell you the story briefly, but I joined Captricity, or rather I met Kwong while running GSVC here at Haas. And I think to some extent the student team is, the structure has changed a little bit, but that in 2010, 2011, the finals were here. There was a massive student team. I'm not sure exactly to the extent that's still the same. But I joined the company because it felt like Kwong was working on problems that really mattered. And I'll tell you a little bit kind of specifically what that meant to him. But the stuff that matters thing actually comes, that photo didn't come out very well on the projector. But the quote comes from Tim O'Reilly. And he runs Strata, he runs O'Reilly Media. They do a lot around conferences, big data, and analytics type of work. We met him through Code for America. And so this is a group that's trying to get tech companies working on problems in government. And so his kind of thing has always been work on stuff that matters. And that can be, in a very large sense, around the big problems that are facing the world, so to speak, but it can also be for each and every institution, and this is what we'll get into with our actual customers. Kind of the punchline is with financial services companies, namely life insurance, which is who we, or where we found kind of our first foothold. These companies are in a way fighting for their life. They're facing an amazing amount of disruption. They're facing an amazing amount of change and new demands from customers that they're really struggling to keep up with. And the thing about insurance is that in each and every case, it's a data problem. It is, what's the information you have about this person? How do you assess and underwrite that risk? And do it in a way that you can be profitable and stay in business doing it. So quickly, kind of the short version to give you some background about the company and where we're coming from. I'll tell you Kwong's story in just a moment, but the company was founded in 2011. We started out, and that's when I met Kwong, we started out very much trying to be B2C. The idea was that we would be a web service that enables just about anybody to show up at a website and access kind of a best-of-breed data capture technology, and I'll give you what that means. But then it was kind of 2013-ish when we first started working for the Food and Drug Administration. And then we first started working for New York Life. I was actually, interestingly enough, on the phone with Berkeley Police because our office had been broken into when the kind of corporate venture guy from New York Life first came to the office and was like, hey, we heard that we need you guys. And it was actually Joe Hellerstein who had made that introduction. And so in spite of that kind of strange start to the relationship, we found that there was a foothold in life insurance for what we do. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But the other kind of thing to mention, we're a venture-funded startup, raised about 3 rounds of capital to date. I joined them right out of school, so it's kind of July of 2012, and so I'm going on just about 4 years with the company. Where Kwong, or where the company, the idea came from, I mentioned that we were founded in 2011, but the core technology has been in the works quite a bit longer. So Kwong was here in the database group in the computer science program. And so as an alumni, you have an amazing resource here with all the other programs and the Berkeley brand. Take advantage of it to the extent you can. I didn't as much as I would. It was very serendipitous and lucky that I met Kwong. But the thing that's relevant about that program is these are the people coming up with amazing new innovations around big data, techniques, technologies, companies. So some really cool stuff happening. Kwong, however, and what kind of attached me to his idea, he basically said, I want to take some of these techniques, some of these innovations we're coming up with around this program, and I want to do good in the world with those. And specifically, he spent a bunch of time working with community health workers. This is a shot from Tanzania. And I know that he's the type of guy who went there thinking, if I can get the data, I can better track malaria trends. I can make sure that donated antiretroviral drugs are getting to the patients who need them. If I can get the data, I can do all of these amazing things. And so he kind of walked in. He actually went, instead of just sitting here in Berkeley and coming up with great ideas, actually went and spent some time on the ground with some of these folks. Basically showed up and said, all right, I'm the data guy, show me your data. And he walked in and found this. Just floor-to-ceiling paper files. And this is all the patient information. This is how those community health workers track their work each day. This is how they follow up and know what families they've given vaccines to, for example. And he actually spent a whole bunch of time run that computer off of a solar panel and managing essentially a 1 or 2 man data entry team so they could try and get to this. They could try and have a slightly more data-driven look at what they needed to do, how they managed their operations, where they needed to focus very scarce resources. And I won't go into the whole story, but it was an immense amount of time and resources that went into doing the data entry to just get to this. And that's what inspired Kwong to kind of say, all right, there's got to be a better way. That's where he went and took a look around at this class of software that Captricity falls into, which is data capture, also known as optical character recognition or optical mark recognition. All that means is the state of the art of software, specifically computer vision, trying to look at a piece of paper or a PDF and tell you what the words, the characters, everything on there actually mean. And so this was kind of the inspiration. Again, that was a little bit the reason I joined the company, was we have a cool technology and we want to use it to solve problems like this. Over 4 years, that's kind of evolved into an ethos of what we call, we want to serve organizations who serve everybody. And that's a really nice way to say that we actually now work often with Fortune 500 type of companies, but we work with companies in regulated industries. So that's a lot of financial services, that's a lot of healthcare, that's public sector. And the reason we do is because those are the organizations that still to this day have a lot of paper. That's what we do. We solve paper problems. And I'll get into why that's the case a little bit later in the talk. So this is a little bit who we are. You can check out captricity.org if you want. We have a cool model where we deeply discount the service still for some of those nonprofits, keep us close to that original mission for the company. But going back to that idea of stuff that matters, take a look at Steve Case's new book and this concept of the third wave. So Steve Case, I didn't know this until I moved to DC, but he was the founder of AOL, now a writer, an investor, and one of his big things, he's got a new book out called The Third Wave. The idea is just that the internet's about to change again, and it's going to be changing the types of industries, the type of companies that have not changed to date. What he means is basically the regulated industries, the people who, for whatever reason, find it really hard to change, find it really hard to adapt new technologies. So it's a cool book, it's a cool concept, worth taking a look at. But so as you'll see, kind of the rest of what I prepared ahead of today is really focused on the experience and the challenges that people in this space face when they want to have a data strategy, right? And so kind of on that note, it's really for folks like that, regulated industries, it's about the constraints that they faced in the past. And so if you'll permit me just a moment, this is, I like to kind of illustrate the constraints or borrow some of these slides rather. These are some tracks from carriages from an old Roman road, right? And the width of the carriage at wheels was 2 horse butts apart, or 2 horse butts wide. That was the reason to create stable carriages, and that ended up defining everything down to roads, mainly railroads. The width of the gauge of railroads is extremely similar to that original concept or that original width from the Roman times. And what does that, you'd think, all right, what does that actually imply for folks? Well, when NASA wants to build engines for the space shuttle, they still have to transport them across the country on train tracks, which means they have to go through tunnels, which means the width of those engines still has to be approximately no more than 2 horse butts wide in a lot of cases, right? So that's a little bit of a strange story, I know, but the point is when we start to see, or the companies that we work with, they have a lot of legacy constraints that the people, even on their analytics, their business intelligence side, they have a lot of constraints that they simply can't change. And that's one of the key challenges around some of their data strategies. So to dive into it a little bit more, a couple good quotes from folks that we have worked with. Hopefully it's fairly straightforward. For the Food and Drug Administration, we're helping them resolve a backlog. And it happened to be around adverse event filings. Kind of the core mission of the FDA is to make sure that the drugs, medical devices on the market are in fact safe for folks. That means when somebody has an adverse event to a drug or a medical device, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, nurses, even URI, goes and files these adverse event claims. What was really cool is Taha, who is kind of our champion on this project, he was the one pioneering a concept called Open FDA. He was the first one to take a lot of this information and make it open data, put it into a platform where third parties could anonymously look at all this information and start to come up with new apps, basically build on top of this core data set that the government agency had, and do new and innovative things with that data that ultimately kind of forward that same mission that the FDA has. So that separately, kind of that open data thing around the public sector is a really cool concept, worth looking into. But Taha's kind of point was for organizations like that, if you can't get at the data, it really doesn't matter. Similarly, we do a lot of work with New York Life. And this was a quote from their business intelligence officer, just saying like, hey, insurance, this was actually at a conference on big data for a whole bunch of other insurers. And he looked at the room and said, you don't have a big data strategy. Even as much as you think you do, you have a little data strategy because you haven't unlocked 90% of the data that is actually relevant to the things you want to do. And so hopefully that's, makes it relevant for folks a little bit. We also like to show this photo. This is the Veterans Administration. Anybody recognize it by chance? The building actually became structurally unstable because of all the paperwork they had in there. Now this is intimately tied to a backlog, a massive backlog for the Veterans Benefit Administration, which is basically the group that adjudicates what type of assistance, medical claims will get paid for our veterans who have been injured injured serving their country, right? So when we look at this as Captricity, we see each of these files is a data-driven decision. They're adjudicators, highly trained adjudicators who have to sift through massive amounts, all of this information, all this paperwork to make complex decisions based on the information in there about what claims should be paid, how we should compensate some of these folks along those lines. Now, the VA has, over the course of more than 5 years now and gone through 3 secretaries, they've tried to build a fully electronic system to do all of this. And they have failed miserably. Frankly, it's kind of a national disgrace in my personal opinion. Immigration is a hot topic politically right now. I've had a number of meetings with the folks at USCIS and their CIO. And one of the comments that was interesting there, has anybody heard of 18F or USDS by chance? A couple cool initiatives run, one's by the White House, one is through the General Services Administration, but they're basically hiring people out of Google and putting them to building better tech tools for the government, right? And so they're saying we're not gonna do the normal government procurement, we're not gonna do the normal big system that's going to cost $1 billion and still fail. We're going to build, from an agile standpoint, we're going to build cool new tech tools. And they have tried to dig into both of these cases. And they're making some headway, but the key thing that they're found is, one, to change some of these forms, it can take an act of Congress. 2, there are 900 pages, in the case of immigration, there are 900 pages of law, policy, and kind of entrenched rules that determine who gets to basically who gets a visa and who doesn't in certain cases. And so part of the reason that when they have tried to build these fully electronic systems, that it's been really hard and they've failed. USCIS has spent $500 million twice with IBM and they still screwed up both times. They're trying to encode 900 pages of law and rules into an electronic system, that's just a really, really hard task, right? And so that's where, again, going back to the point of us, we solve paper problems. We've learned a few lessons, and so hopefully this is relevant when you think about the data strategy, again, for folks in regulated industries. But first and foremost, paper can be the proper tool to get a job done, but what we've learned is that folks confuse where do you store your information versus how is it transported to you. Paper can be appropriate when you're dealing with poor, immigrant, elderly populations, things like that, but only to transport the data, only to get it to the organization. It's not kind of to the point from the VA photo. It's not the way to store that information, right? And we'll get into a little bit more around that in a second. The other thing is for regulated institutions, when you want to change something, when you want to include new or better IT tools so you can access more data, so you can unlock, so you can leverage new analytics tools, if you're touching some of those core processes, you can run into serious challenges. I mean, we walk into some of these insurance companies and there's still COBOL databases and green screens because they're so tied to these core underwriting or claims processing operations that the company has tried multiple times and failed to change. So when you think about how do you work in a new tool, how do you leverage data in a new way, it really needs to be non-disruptive as it relates to kind of those core operational processes, or oftentimes it's going to fail. People will confuse, or they will kind of mentally, they can't separate what's the system I use from what's the way that I actually go about a certain process, right? And the last thing we see around, for some of these organizations, what's relevant for their data is what do you want to do from today forward versus what has the organization learned in the past? Where is that organizational learning kind of wrapped up? Is it in a system somewhere? Is it stuck on paper? Is it just in people's heads who have been there a long time? And so again, as you start thinking about change, those are some of the things that we've found have been kind of relevant. I'll dive into some specific examples around the life insurers we work with that hopefully will make that a little bit more relevant. So here's the part I'm not trying to pitch you on Captricity, but I'm going to do it just a little bit. So specifically the problem we now solve, I mentioned kind of the Fortune 500 life insurers. We have, I mentioned we started very much kind of a B2C type of service. It was working with the FTA and New York Life initially that we decided to pivot and become much more of an enterprise SaaS service. And now we focus almost exclusively on life insurers, kind of the top end of the market, the top 123 or so. And what we found is that manual data entry, it's probably been building up to this, is probably not a surprise, but manual data entry is or remains extremely important to how they manage their business processes, right? And that truly is that's a data challenge for them because again, underwriting a risk, understanding your fraud that might be coming up in your claims process, better interacting with your customers or interacting with your customers in a way that they want to. Especially when you want to, say, automate some of those things a little bit more, those are all data challenges. And the truth is when you have information, especially handwritten, coming in on paper, which is what the majority of these customers' transactions or interactions with their customers are these days, manual data entry is very costly, it's slow, and it's very error prone. And so quickly, just hopefully this kind of anchors you a little bit. That's the piece of the puzzle, or that's the problem that Captricity helps solve. We help take images of their forms and we automate that data entry process. The way that we do that and the kind of the cool tech that underlies it, from a software standpoint, it's quite a bit newer. This is where Kwong was actually in the CS program and was very much a database guy. We're using some newer machine learning techniques complemented with a way to do basically secure human verification. It means we just have people in the loop who help prime and verify those machine learning algorithms. The output is exactly what you would expect. It's you feed into our system an image of a handwritten form. What you get back is basically a spreadsheet with all of that data as if people had sat there and typed it in for you. But the cool thing there is instead of leaving that information on paper, having people look at that paper to do something with the information, data now can flow into multiple systems. It can flow not only into your underwriting system, but also into your data warehouse. It can flow into an analytics platform. You can wrap and bundle it all up and do some really interesting things with it. And so that's where some of our customers are starting to see a lot of value. I'll give you a quick story with New York Life. Kind of that first place that we got started was it was actually a marketing use case. This is a small piece of their business that's called New York Life Direct. In this case, they actually have a promotion with AARP. They send out these business reply cards actually in the magazine in different promotions. People fill out these cards and send it back in. My guess is, has anybody in this room ever filled out one of these cards before in their life? Yeah, me neither. So keep in mind that this is the folks that they're targeting with these types of promotions are very different from you and I, right? But that's, again, when you think about how when you're, a few years from now, when you're working with a company, you're trying to implement some sort of data strategy. Like, it's not what just you and I want. It's who are the customers that are going to be using that, right? In this case, it was a great story for us. That got us started with a whole bunch of other work in New York Life that I'll talk about briefly, but kind of the punchline was they had 10 people in a room doing manual data entry every single day, and they had that. They were spending that kind of money because these are marketing leads. We all know that the faster you follow up with a lead, the more likely you are to close a sale, right? And so for these customers, that was extremely important to them, to get this data into a form so they could act on it. And that was the piece that Captricity was able to help automate a little bit. That then gets us into working on other pieces of the business, a whole bunch of other workflows. And for insurance companies, there are kind of three big things. First and foremost, it's new applications, so new policies that you want to underwrite. There's all the management of your in-force policies, which is basically somebody wants to change a beneficiary, they change their address or update some other contact information. Think of that as just policy management. And then you pay out claims. That's the purpose that insurance serves. The company wants to know that when they're going to pay out a claim, they're paying it out appropriately. It is a risk, something that they actually decided to underwrite. But what we found, especially working in New York Life, was we can spend a ton of time focusing on the first, say, 5 workflows, some of those core workflows, the new business piece, the claims piece, things like that. And it's about the top 5 or so or 10 transactions that make up half of their paper flow. But then what about all of the other workflows that are there that are lower volume per workflow? But from an IT perspective, you can't invest the same level of resources to operationalize, to automate all those other hundreds of workflows, right? And so when New York Life thinks about its data strategy and the fact that right now they have tons of this information coming into them on paper, they can't invest the resources to go automate all of it. And so they're looking to tools. Captricity happens to be a tool that might be able to help in a lot of these cases, but they're looking to tools that will free up that data, that will give them access to the information they want, so they can bring new tools to bear on it, so that they can automate some of their customer interactions, so that they can leverage analytics around what they know about some of these different customers. Interestingly, worth noting is that it's amazing how often when you dive into some of these processes, the knowledge about that process is just wrapped up in people's heads. We often, as a side note, when we go in and are trying to set up a new workflow, so that we can capture the data for that customer and help them do something useful for it, we're one of the first people to actually help them map out how the steps of that process actually happen. Yeah.
Are you taking questions at the end, or should I just...
I'm sorry, I had mentioned that. Please jump in with questions, but I will leave time at the end too.
So I'm a bit confused because your website says that you convert that paper text into a thing, so that's the main business model. But when you're working with companies like New York Life, you're essentially changing their process flow. Like changing
Correct.
the way they're looking into data. Instead of going from manual, they are moving into automated. So that is the tool perspective of your business model. So I just wanted to ask you, like, in deeper, like, how does that procurement take place? Do you work with IT? Like, do you just give them a bunch of machines? So how does that happen?
It's an interesting question. When you say, do we give them a bunch of machines?
Like, how do you work with them to actually automate all of their process flows, like step by step?
Yeah, so I'm not going to claim that we do all of it. From Captricity's standpoint, you can think about us as an enabling type of technology, right? So I'll get into it a little bit later, but we'll often go back and we'll look at a bunch of legacy data for an organization like this. And we'll build that initial database for them. And then we don't do the analytics necessarily, but we have a bunch of partners. We bring in other folks who help them. Let's say it's underwriting. We'll help them take a new look and kind of compare how the actuarial tables that they're using match up with what they expect, with what they maybe are actually paying out in claims. Then, once you have some of these better models, once you've come up with a better predictive algorithm, well, then you've got to turn that around and operationalize it on the next application that comes in, which means you need data from that application. It can't be the handwriting on paper because a person, it's not efficient for them to sit there and look at what's on the paper and try to like run that algorithm on a calculator or something, right? So you have to take what you learn, the insights you get from looking through all of that legacy information, and then somehow turn it into or work it into your new business workflow or that operational process, right? And so that's where Captricity by no means does all of that. But we do integrate with those systems. We do integrate with those processes. We partner with the folks who are doing that much, much better. So that's where, while tactically our tool does a little bit of the slice, when we walk in and talk to customers, we're talking to them about the whole kind of process. Their robotic process automation is a big buzzword right now, so we're talking about stuff like that. Does that answer your question? Great. And I'll get into an example of that momentarily. And I kind of lost the flow of this one or what exactly I had meant to say with this slide, but I think it roughly goes back. I do love the visual. And it really goes back to, again, when you're thinking about how do you take some of that data, leverage it from an analytics standpoint, and then try to impose some change on an organization. Really, who are you designing for? So I'm going to bring this back now to kind of the existential threat that we actually see and discuss with our insurance customers. And it often comes in a form of somebody like this. This is a cool company. They're called All Life. They're out of South Africa. And they have found a way to profitably provide health insurance to folks who have HIV and diabetes as well. And the interesting thing about their model is that contrary to most traditional insurance where you say, what's kind of your health status today? Yes or no, I will provide you insurance and here's how much it's going to cost you. They make having access to their health insurance a function of you complying with certain policies, certain procedures, certain treatment regimens actually, that they know will prevent the worst of the effects from either diabetes or AIDS from a health standpoint, meaning if you continue to go and get certain treatments, if you continue to follow up with your doctor on the prescribed regimen, your policy is still active. The moment you fall off of that, your policy is no longer active. And this is very contrary to the way a lot of health insurance or a lot of life insurance works. They are a life insurance company. It's contrary to the way a lot of it works. It's kind of this idea of continuous underwriting. And the point here is that you can't do that without a ton of data. You can't do that without access to, is that person following up with this regimen on an ongoing basis? This gets into how do you leverage information from devices. In this case, they're medical devices, but those could just as well be sensors from somebody's watch to something else in their environment, right? How do you leverage information like that to do this concept of continuous underwriting? And this is the existential threat for a lot of the big insurance companies that we work with. I mean, imagine the day when Facebook and Google have so much information about you, they can underwrite your life insurance better than New York Life. Like, that's the type of threat that our customers are starting to face. And that's why they're trying to use tools like Captricity to unlock data, to enable analytics, to have a real data strategy, so that they can face this threat, so they can confront it in an interesting way. And when they think about what can they do, and I think this is, if there's any takeaway from all of the talk, I think it's when you think about regulated industries, what's the one piece, what's the one key advantage that they have that Google, Facebook, some of these new entrants, even though they have tons of data, what's the one piece that they don't have and will never have? And that's the history and the experience that a New York Life, a MetLife, a Mass Mutual, it's the history of working with customers that the companies actually have. Unfortunately, that's where that information is, where is that information? That's the piece where it's wrapped up. And so I missed that was Sanjayda. This goes a little bit to your question. One of the projects that we did with New York Life, they asked us to look through a whole bunch of claims data. I think it was about 7 years worth of claims packages. And not that you care too much tactically, but a claims package is hundreds of pages, either on paper or in PDF, with a whole bunch of different forms, correspondence, all sorts of things wrapped up in there. New York Life said, there's a whole bunch of information specifically from one piece of that claims packet. It's a little morbid, I know, but it's the death certificate, that we'd never capture any of that information as a part of processing the claim. That adjudicator along the way might look at that piece of paper, use that information to inform the claim decision, but they never actually capture it in a system. So they have tons of PDFs or physical paper, maybe sitting literally in an Iron Mountain warehouse somewhere. And they said, hey, Captricity, could you look through 7 years of these claims packets, go find us first the death certificate, and then go grab 20 key pieces of data off of each of those, and basically produce us that first data set, that first, the foundation for kind of a bunch of future analytics and things. And this is relevant for them because there's a bunch of fraud information. The way to say it is, there's a massive amount of fraud in the claims process. The sooner they can identify that fraud has a direct impact on their bottom line. And even for the claims that aren't fraudulent, there's a huge financial benefit if an insurance company is that much more precise about predicting what they'll actually have to pay, because then they can manage their investment strategy that much better. And so this is where Captricity was able to bring some cool new technology to help solve that problem. And I'd love to talk about the technology all day, but I think it's less relevant to this class. The point was we're able to go and pick out some really tough images that look like these. We have a cool machine learning piece that does that for us. We're able to then go identify, this one says like respiratory arrest. We're able to actually read and digitize handwriting like that. And ultimately what we're doing is producing this massive data file for this company, so the business intelligence team on their side can dig in and start doing some analytics, so they can find out, based on the information we knew ahead of time when somebody applied, and based on what we now know that we've paid their claim, how good are we at actually predicting how well they'll do. And so when you start to open up information like this, you can get better at underwriting, you can get better at how do you automate some of the cool things you can do around interacting with your customers and making this product that's kind of amorphous to people much more relevant, so on and so forth. And so what this kind of feeds into, and what we found that conceptually is really appealing to kind of the CIO at an insurance company like a New York Life, is this concept of how do I optimize some of these legacy processes and have them feeding digital data into some central repository where I can then go and reference a whole bunch of third-party data sources, like a LexisNexis of the world and things they provide. These massive data sources you can complement and enrich the information you're getting directly from a customer. That's where the sensors and some of that starts to come in. And then ultimately you can enable not just a new user experience, but in certain cases, really new business models. So that was a lot, kind of a mouthful. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I had a question. Are you worried about Captricity kind of working themselves out of a job once all these companies go digital and they don't need the paper capture? Like, the medical records, all the Kaiser and other, insurers and hospital groups are on digital records now.
Yeah.
Are you worried about once you do a great job with all those industries, you're left with just professional services or analytics?
So it's a great question, Chris, and thank you. I realized I skipped over one little thing in there. So we often get that question, like, isn't the paper going away? Another thing will be like, well, if you want, instead of having the handwriting on paper, why don't you just use a web form, right? Like, why don't people just type this stuff into a computer in the first place? And I think the answers are kind of related, right? The truth is that the paper is going away, but less quickly than you would expect. And so actually, I'm not concerned about Captricity's business model. We have plenty of runway to help optimize a lot of big companies, and that's just in this country. It's kind of the quip that the sum product of all human knowledge is online now. Well, it's certainly not the sum product of all human information. A lot of the human information, when you look internationally, is still stuck on paper. It's still inaccessible to modern information technology, right? So we have a long ways to go before we're truly working ourselves out of a job. But to the web forms piece, like, why don't people just use web forms? Why don't we just, I've got my cell phone somewhere, people would just type that into their phones. They would apply for insurance online. And the truth is, they will someday. When the rest of us, when folks in this room are buying insurance, we might be able to. It turns out, I don't know, has anybody in this room ever bought life insurance? Maybe as kids? Yeah. What was the process like? Long. Did you have somebody like sit down with a financial advisor type of thing?
Yes, I actually just did like a month ago from State Farm.
Okay.
So I actually went into the neighborhood agent's office and talked through the different options and
Yeah.
figured out 5 different plans and
Yeah.
amounts and what the policies would look like.
Yeah. And did you sit down and kind of fill out with you one of these big forms, 10, 20 something pages type of thing, or
So
did
you?
you?
There's actually is electronic, so they have a little signature pad that is basically you look at the form on the screen, and then you sign the pad.
Okay.
As you actually agree to the policies.
Good. So there's somebody kind of picking up some of the newer tech. But why'd you have to go and sit down with somebody to do that? It's because these are extremely complex products to sell, right? That's why they're highly regulated. These are really, really tricky to understand in a lot of cases for you to figure out what's the best case for you. I'm actually glad to hear that State Farm is doing some of that. I'll check them off of our list of targets to kind of go after. But no, what we find is that while you can, in certain cases, and this goes back to kind of the design question, you can, in certain cases, build other experiences for customers. But with a lot of life insurance, the way that the products are sold, the people who are doing the selling, they just don't want to change. They don't use it. Every insurance company we talk to has some initiative to build web forms around what they're doing. It's just that the customers actually using those is in the single digits or 10, 20% of all their application flow or some things. So that will change over time. And I think Captricity will actually be a part of that change. But the truth is, the story today is that that's not the case. People are still using a lot of paper, and yet today the insurers have the necessity to go use that information, use that data in a more strategic way, and that's where they're stuck, kind of caught in this breach that Captricity can help fill, or tools like Captricity. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the machine learning piece that you bring to the table? Is that just a character recognition piece, or is there also kind of a way of extracting the relevant features from the documents? Or do you, when it comes to creating a database around, say, death certificates, is there a content expert that will kind of be familiar with what these documents look like and kind of decide what you should be looking for, or is there some learning process which kind of identifies the structure of these documents and figures out, this set of documents has this feature located in this portion of the document, and we know that this lines up with this other feature because they're all, city names, or how does it work?
Yeah, so it's kind of it's kind of tangential to what you're saying, meaning we're not the content experts for any customer, whether it's healthcare, whether it's insurance, whether it's government. We're not the content experts on what pieces of information might you care about. So like in the death certificate example in New York Life, we needed them to tell us, here are the 20 fields we think would be really valuable if we had them in this massive data set, right? But when we actually start looking at the documents, we have a whole bunch of proprietary computer vision technology that creates kind of what we call a digital fingerprint of that document. And that's actually an industry term. Basically just analyzes literally the lines, the landmarks, the structure of the page. And from there, on each version of that there's a learning process. You have to go through and tag, all right, well this, on the LA County form, the city, or maybe the better is kind of who is the coroner, the physician is here, whereas Golden County in Colorado, the death certificates are issued by county. It's a strange fact we found out by this, and there are always over 3,000 counties in the country. That physician is in a slightly different place on the form. So like all machine learning, you need training data. And so in this case, we have the customers tell us what's the content you care about from your forms. What are the pieces of information you actually want to capture? Then we have to go through an exercise of creating the training data and identifying where the relevant information is on the form. But once we have that training data, that's where there's a machine learning engine that goes through and automatically identifies what are the key elements on each version of that form that I need to look for, so that when I find the next instance of the same form from Golden County, I can go find that physician name, and I can go find the date, and I can go find whatever the cause was, and I can find all of this other relevant information. So that's like one whole piece of the learning system relative to the computer vision piece. And then there's kind of a second learning system, and this is much more wrapped up with the crowdsourcing piece, that then says, all right, I know that this is, they've got kind of a cause written in there. Then we have a whole separate kind of piece of our technology stack that's really good at leveraging the machine learning piece along with human workers to securely help prime and verify those algorithms, but to identify that actually says respiratory arrest, right? And so you can think about it a little bit as a two-stage model, if you will, in the way that we do first the document recognition and then the data capture. But the key thing there is we don't pretend to be the content experts. We have the technology and the platform to enable the company to really quickly and easily solve a problem like this. Does that answer your question, Greg? Oh, yeah.
So at some point in your presentation, you mentioned that you work with the FDA, and you mentioned some government applications. For me, since coming here in the US, I know two of them that actually made the media, the healthcare.gov, that was like failure, and then the FDA app that tells you to go right or left, that like people build online in 5 minutes, and then they paid it also like thousands, tens of thousands of dollars.
TSA.
What? TSA, yes. And then the question to you is, when you're working with the government, how can you avoid being on that list? And how do you make sure that the way they're using you, the applications you're making for them, are actually not going to be on that list?
That's a really good question, actually. So I will say, having done just a little bit of work with the government, and specifically the federal government, which is where those types of failures are the most prominent or get the most notice. The sad truth of it is the companies that are best at winning that business are often the worst at delivering on it. And I could spend way too much time talking about government procurement. That's not for this class. But the point is, it's a really messy system that, while it's in theory was built to ensure fairness amongst vendors, ends up creating more of a barrier of entry. And for the most part, when you talk about technology, it works really well when you're building a bridge or a building. But when you're talking about a technology system, the truth is that the rules are, in my mind, outdated. And what ends up happening is the people who are good at winning that business end up kind of flubbing on the implementation, and that's where you end up in the papers, so to speak. So the good news is that there are some initiatives. This administration has been fairly good at trying to change or trying to update some of the rules or work within certain frameworks to make things a little bit more flexible when it comes to technology. And so if you really want to nerd out, you can look into something called the tech FAR, which is basically within the existing procurement rules, how can agencies procure better technology? How can they operate and build technology in an agile manner? That then opens up a lot of newer, better companies that might be willing to do that type of work. So some things are changing. But frankly, to answer your question directly, Andre, it's like, be careful. We're fortunate we solve a very specific problem. We are not, like I said, we partner with and integrate with the tools that would do a lot of the other work downstream. And that, frankly, is also the reason that we haven't worked with, say, immigration just yet. Because it's such a political football at this point that even where we think we can help, we're not going to invest the resources to get through that process, only to get in there and then they're just like, nope, we're changing or doing something totally different. Like they're not stable enough for us to really, as a startup, and we still are in many ways a startup, we're not dedicating the time to like figuring out that challenge for a lot of the federal government. It takes too long. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about pricing?
Yeah.
You can actually, how you learn about your customers' willingness to pay and how you determine that value that you're.
Yeah. In a nutshell, we ask them how many people they pay to type in the information currently. There are cases where we compete with other software products, but really, in our specific case, we are automating a manual process. And so it's first and foremost to help figure out what that return might be for a customer. It's digging into the status quo costs of their process. And then it's typically, we're typically roughly half of their status quo cost, right? So if we can find out how much they're spending on typically people to do this currently, that gives us a baseline for that return. Turns out, and we're actually in the process of, now that we've grown, now that we just raised another round of capital, we're going to be investing more resources and saying, all right, what are the other value drivers on top of that that maybe we weren't factoring into that kind of cost equation before, right? And we can hire consultants to help us do that now, which is awesome. But the truth is, it's really, how much does it cost you today? How many people do you have doing it? Maybe you have it broken down on a per form or per application basis. And we price per field. We price per piece of data that we digitize for folks. And so that's hard. It's hard to go from this concept of, in your operations class, like this very fixed resource that has a certain capacity and a certain error rate, to a software as a service model where it can scale up, it can scale down, all sorts of things. And it's a subscription, So it's not always an easy conversation to change folks, but when you have that type of, it's probably going to be half the cost, it's compelling enough to get past that. Yeah, Justin.
So I imagine a lot of the data that you're getting access to with these companies is obviously pretty valuable, and you're working with companies in regulated industries. So I'm wondering, have you had difficulty getting them to trust you to actually work with them, and maybe what industries, or what, you don't have to name companies, but what industries have been the most difficult? If you have insight into that.
That's a great question.
Who do you talk to at these companies to start those conversations?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part first. We start with the operations folks, or maybe up to kind of a CIO type of level, because those are the folks who want the data and they want to act on it. Those are also the folks who want to, they feel kind of the competitive stress. And so they're the ones who say, well, Allstate can fill out an application online. I need to give a similar and better customer experience to my customers to be competitive, right? So it's the operational folks who feel the pain very dearly. And then we have to go to the kind of their compliance group. And so we spend a lot of time, we're often, for the insurance companies, if not the first, one of the first applications that's in the cloud. And so we spend a lot of time educating their information security folks about what it means to be a secure cloud service, what risks that implies, how we mitigate those risks. People totally underestimate the risk of running their stuff on premise, right? That's kind of the, what was the insurer in California that, there was some massive data breach here in California. It was like a health insurer, and they didn't even they didn't encrypt any of the data that they had. And those are the type of people who will sit there and pull us through the ringer over information security stuff. So they tend to have kind of a skewed perception of their own risk, but it's a ton of education. I will say, interestingly, the government is putting in place frameworks and has kind of top-down, like literally from the president, mandates to leverage the cloud quite a bit more. So they, while they're slow to do anything, they're, I think, the ones feeling most of the change. For insurance companies, it's competitive forces that are forcing them to look at the cloud type of technologies. And I think from there you've got the kind of Jeffrey Moore's adoption curve. So it's hard to say. There are no industries, I think, that are better or worse. It's really, can you find the early adopters within each industry? So.
All right, Brian, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Greg.